Hello everyone. Let's try to understand today, in continuation of our Docker understanding, that how the Docker networking is, how the containers when you are creating, then those are connecting with each other. Is really the containers are getting any IP addresses? And if the Docker or container engine or container software is running on a host, then how it is communicating with the host network. Okay, so let's try to draw a host here. So assume that this is my Docker host machine. Now inside this Docker host machine, I can take a user also who is outside of this Docker machine somewhere over here. And what happens with Docker? When I have this machine by the way, and I have Docker installed. If I run Docker ps, you all can see that the command is working. So Docker, when you install at the very first time, it creates few default networks. And Docker CLI is a very friendly CLI available, which you can use to communicate with Docker instance. But when you install the Docker, what happens and what the interfaces you will have. So if you try to check out any features, any properties of your Docker, right, then the Docker info command is very helpful. So when you run Docker info, DOCKER Docker info, yeah, then this will present you most of the things about the Docker. For example, let's talk from here. So it states that the Docker engine software you are using is actually community CE version of it. You have few plugins. We will talk about the plugins later on, but two plugins are already part of it. Earlier we had Docker-Compose. Docker Compose, um, we had to install the Docker Compose application, means the CLI, as a separate option. But now Docker already has this Docker Compose giving as an option of plugins. BuildX is being used for building any container images. So if you see, these two plugins are available. Then this Docker info command will tell you that how many containers you have. Out of those containers, how many are in a running condition, how many are paused, how many are in a stop condition, how many images you have locally available, write one. Okay, and then it will talk about the Docker is presenting all the logs in which format. So logging driver here is JSON file. Okay, then it says that there are plugins also. The default volume plugin is storage. Local, I will talk about the storage section later on where I will try to explain that what this meaning is. Now see here the network. It says that network type is bridge, host, IPVLAN, MAC VLAN, null and overlay. What is the bridge meaning? That we will try to understand, right? So with this Docker CE installation, there are other log drivers are also available apart from the log driver, which we have seen as JSON file here, the logging driver, right? We have AWS logs. We can print our container logs in AWS log format. We can print in a FluentD, Guelph General D, JSON file we already have as a default, local, Splunk and syslog. So if you want to change the property of this Docker installation so that it should produce your log in a format of friendly to Splunk, then you can you can do the settings. We will try to understand, right? And if you see the is, uh, Docker has a runtime container D, right? This is a runtime using which there are containerd and runc, two different runtimes available using which Docker is running currently. Okay, the containers would be running. So default runtime mentioned here is as runc. There are security options like AppArmor and others. We will try to understand the security section also. Now this is talking about the host, that what host operating system is, what is the operating system type, what is the architecture of host where the Docker installation you have performed, how many CPUs are much, how much is the memory available. So Docker Lab is your host name of this host machine, right? And then a random ID of this Docker installation. Then Docker also talks about what is the root directory. Now what is the root directory? In our last video we talk about the root directory, that all the Docker resource which you will be creating right after Docker installation using Docker CLI, you would be creating volumes, storage, instances, containers, images, etc. Everything will go on inside of this location, right, in their respective directory. We have seen that. Insecure registry, here the local host is mentioned as that this is an insecure registry. What is the meaning of the insecure registry? That also we'll try to understand later. So here if you see the network section, right, the current topic. So bridge host, there are many network driver using which we can create the network, but using these Docker, when you are installing, simply the installation of Docker C with the way how we explained earlier. If you have not seen that video, if you haven't watched that, then please I would recommend to see that video. Okay, so Docker is, as I said, it's very friendly with the CLI. So if you run, let's say, Docker and then hyphen hyphen help, it will talk about how many other commands after Docker you can give, right? And there is a small pattern which you can understand. So the pattern is like Docker and then, which I like most, let's say you have to interact with what? You have to interact with network. Okay, fine, network. Then what you want to do? If you want to list, let's say list, right? If you want to list, this is a list. What else you can do? You can create, you can delete, remove, right, or anything else. But what options are available? If you run hyphen hyphen help, then for Docker network, how many options are available, that it will showcase to you. You can create, you can connect to a network, you can disconnect to a network, you can inspect the network. Now inspect is a command which is available with almost every options, right? I'll tell you that the same friendly command is available for other Docker resources as well. Inspect is something which helps us to get detailed information of any component. Docker component are network, images, containers, volume, storage, etc., etc., right? Prune is for removing unused things. RM is to remove the network. LS is to list the network. We can use list also, which I run that right here, list. So the same thing will happen with the other things, like let's say volume. You can run volume ls, how many volumes you have, that it will tell. Same thing you can run with container also, container ls or container list. But this is not showing any containers. It means that the containers are not in active condition. So how you will get to know? So you want to list the container with Docker container list, but you want to list all the containers. So you can use hyphen hyphen all. And then it shows that there are containers which are available but in an exited status. I will talk about the status also later on and all these properties like the ports and the names, etc. So Docker container list. Now we can list with the same way, right? With the same command pattern, we can list down our images as well. Okay, so hang on, I think let me increase the font. So not images but image. Okay, so Docker image list, Docker volume list, Docker network list, Docker container list, all of these commands are available. Almost similar commands. So if you once know this, then it's very easy for you to interact with Docker with this Docker CLI. Docker CLI is very easy. Now we will talk about the network. So I was running Docker network list command. You got to know that there are several network drivers, the networks created. So there are three different networks you will find out always with a fresh Docker Community Edition installation. First one is a bridge. The driver type is bridge. Second one is host. The driver type is host. And then there is none. We will talk about this bridge one first. Okay. So let's try to check here in our diagram. Whenever you install your Docker CE, what Docker does, Docker creates a bridge network. Let's say that this is a bridge network. This is my machine. So obviously in my machine, I would have one Ethernet. So I'm gonna write down this, let's say one Ethernet. Let's say I have here, I have ETH0. With this ETH0, I have an IP address assigned. I can give one IP address name here also, just to mention so that we can easily understand things better. 192.168.1.12. For example, and my Docker host has an IP address of 50. So let's say this is my Docker host with this IP address running on there, right? If I run IPA, I will get to know that the IP address is 192.168.150. So 150 is my host IP address. The moment I install Docker CE, what it does, it creates a bridge network by default. So if you want to understand more on bridge network and its property, we can inspect this element. How? We can run Docker inspect, and then what you want to inspect? I want to inspect network. What is the network name which you want to inspect? We want to inspect network as bridge. So the moment you give this Docker inspect network bridge, same way you can inspect image, you can inspect container, you can inspect many other elements also. So when you run this, you get to know that the bridge name network with bridge kind of driver has been created as default. IP address management, IPAM section, if you go, then there it says that does this network, what it has created, it has a subnet of 172.17.0.0/16, and the gateway is this. What does it mean? That you will have multiple containers created, then each container will get one IP address from this subnet. Okay. Uh, so sorry, I think Docker inspect bridge network doesn't require. So that's how it is. So now what happens when I will be creating a container? Actually, we have a containers, right? If you see Docker ps-a, Docker ps is a alias of other Docker container list, right? There are many aliases. So container ID, this one, this is exited state. I want to start it. So if I run Docker container start, and then this is a container ID. So this container gets started. Now if I run Docker container list -- all, you see that one container is up with the container ID. I run this command and it has started. I could give the names also. Up from last 7 seconds, right? Now if I run Docker inspect bridge, okay, Docker network, I want to inspect the network bridge. Then what you see here is that you see a container section. Earlier it was not available because the container was existing, but it was not present. It was not running. So it did not get, it means that I told you that the container is a process. If the process is not running, it's not utilizing any of the resources. When the process, Linux process start running, whether in a form of container, in form of a binary, if a process starts running, it starts utilizing the resources. So now when you have this container running, you will get to know that this container, the name is this, and with this MAC address, it has got one IP address slash from the same subnet if you see /16, but it has got 0.2 as IP address. Now what happens if you run all the containers, right? Then you will see it's a containers, and there you will find all the containers ID in a map value, right? Let's try to see that. So Docker ps-a, then I can run all the containers in one command. So I will use docker start. I could run docker container start as well, but as I said, these are the aliases. So I'm going to take this ID, I'll take this ID. And then when I run docker start, both the containers now running. So if I run docker ps only, or docker ps-a, then I see that rest of the two containers also now running. So what if I run docker network inspect, right? So when I run docker network inspect bridge, what I see is that now the containers, and it's a map in JSON. We have one container ID, second container ID, third. And the first container ID, this has got 0.4, this has got 0.3, this has got 0.2 IP addresses. So let's try to understand this one from here, right? So we have a bridge network, and this has a subnet of 172.617.0.0/16, right? Let's make it clear. Yeah, that was there. So when this bridge network gets created, what do you see here? That your containers are also creating, right? You are creating the containers. So for instance, here is your container. So you got container A, and this container A is running container B, container C, container B, container C. So all of these containers will get an IP address, and I'm writing down the IP addresses, not 172.17.0.2. Let's say the first container which has got this IP address. Another container will have 3, then we'll have 4. That's how the IP addresses distributions are. You all can get the verification, right? So we understand that this container is getting IP address from this bridge network 2, 3, 4 from the same subnet. It means that these containers are part of the same network. It means that these containers would be talking to each other, right? We can check out this network section by getting into the container, and we can try communicating to each other. But the containers would be communicating to each other because they are in a same subnet. That's how the networking principles is. But eventually, what does it mean that if I have a communication, let me set up these communication first, the container and the bridge. Okay. Now, these containers are part of the same network, A, B, and C. They are communicating with each other also. But the question is, when this user wants to connect to this network, this container, for instance, user cannot straight away go to this network. Why? Because user can reach up to this IP address only. After this IP address, there is nothing, right? Then what happens? Then, and that's a problem also here. If you see the containers, right? I am running Docker PS, and if I see the port here is port 80, port 80, port 80. It means that we know that the containers are running on port 80. So if I try to give container ports also here, port 80, port 80, port 80. All the containers are running on same port. But because the container interfaces has different IP addresses, port 80 eventually they can have. There is no problem at all because there is no conflict because they are in a same network but with a different IP addresses. So there's no problem. But question is, what if I want that this container should be accessible by this user? If this user is uh, putting the IP address or host name or something in browser, then this container, whichever the content is, it should be available. User can connect up to here, but you see, if user is able to uh, reach to this IP address, host IP address, it means that internally the network can be taken care of. How? We called it as destination netting or netting solution. Okay. Now what is netting? When someone from outside is trying to connect to this IP address, this person will understand that this IP address I am connecting, but the request will be translated or forwarded to this particular container. Now the question is, because we have one single IP address, right? So how the translation will happen? So what we can do is we can use port here as 80, and we can map to this containers port 80 with help of netting. The communication is called it as destination netting. So here is this port IP, port 80. Here is this port 80 for this container, and uh, this is how the communication established. But this is a netting section, and we can write down here also netting. Now question is, who performs this net? In Linux we have IP tables. IP tables are performing this netting. We can precisely call it as destination netting. So when the request is coming in this direction, and then this is how, right? So when your packet reaches from this user browser to here, then the target was 1.50. But here the port is on port 80, the request is getting forwarded, and the netting is getting coming in picture here, right? And then with this netting, the user will be able to access this. But to perform this denetting means the port forwarding, or we can say port mapping, we have to do some changes in our command. So I'm gonna delete these containers, docker rm. I'll give you this, or let's keep all of them. So I will run same docker run command again, docker run -d nginx. But -d means that detach mode, right? So if I don't put -d here, then my current session will be caught up with the container session itself. Okay, then I have to run control C, etc. Now the port mapping function is -p. This is the argument. With -p we can pass the host. Let's say if I want to expose on port 80 host and port 8080, sorry, the left hand side will be the host and right hand side will be the container port, host port and container port. So because I want to make this 8080 as a host port, I will have some design change. So think like this is 8080. So I'm trying to map, if somebody is accessing this IP address on 8080, it should be, this container should be accessible, so that I can make accessible all of these containers also from the same IP address but on a different port. That's netting will be doing. So here it is, right? If I run this command, my container gets created. What is the change now we experience here? If I run docker ps, what you see here, that the host means all the IP addresses, port 8080 is getting mapped with port 80 of this container. Okay, so we will have this 80 accessible now because the mapping is looks like established, right? So if I go ahead here and I'll try to run localhost, sorry, um, my host IP. I'm a user and I have to connect to my host IP, which the IP address is 50, and then port 8080. I get welcome to Nginx. It means that, yeah, the netting is working. What if I put down the container? So docker stop and giving the container ID here. Then if the container is not running, docker ps-a, if it is not running, it means that port mapping is down. I told you that when the container is not up and running, container is a process, so it will um, not be utilizing any host processes, any host resources, including the network also. So now that port and everything is free, so if I run refresh again, I say that I am getting that site can't be reached. So if I run this container again, and you see within fraction of second this starts it, right? So start container running, and you see my Nginx web server is up, right? Now I want to run the same Nginx containers but on a different ports. So what I can run is same like we did yesterday. We can run, but now if I want to map this 808080 again, is it possible? Let's try. When I'm running, the container gets created, but it says this port is already allocated, man, 8080. Because your host, if you go ahead and try to understand this design, you see that your host has a single IP, and one IP cannot have duplicate ports. That is why it is saying one port which you are trying that's got assigned already. So if I run docker ps again, right, what I get is that the container has been created, but the port which you have given, that's because of that it's not up, it's not running. So what happens if I try docker start container? It will not come up, and it will always say that driver fails the programming external connectivity on endpoint. Port is already allocated. So when you run docker psa, again you say that the container has got created, but that is not available. So I have only one way around, that I can remove the docker. So I'm saying docker rm, delete the container, container got deleted. If I run docker ps-a, right, then I see no docker processes are running. Now what does it mean? That I have to run container, but mapping I have to correct for host. Here port 80, it's fine, right? It's fine. Container can run on port 80. So instead of 8080, I want to run 80, I want to map 8081. And because this port was free, it got allocated. Now if I run docker ps again, you see that 8081 has got mapped with 80. So essentially what does it mean? That when I'll try to run 8080, their Nginx process is already running. When I will try 8081, again I will get Nginx process, and you see that Nginx has started running. I don't have anything running on port 8082, right? But if I want in a similar way, right, to map another Nginx container with 82, and when the container is now running, right, so I have 8080, 8081, 8082 mapped with 3 different containers which are already running. So 2, now 2 also has welcome to Nginx. That was the network containers, that how we can assign a port, how a user would be able to reach to a container. Okay, so that's how for now. Thank you very much.